with us this morning, if you would.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate you, man. Yes. Good morning. Yes, thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction. And Marmy and I do feel very much a part of your family and community, so thank you for always welcoming us in the powerful way that you do. We have a complicated relationship with things that are old. Yeah? Yeah. On the one hand, we speak about the good old days. And on Thursday, some of us post pictures that are a throwback to an earlier era. And on New Year's Eve, we sing Old Lang Syne, remembering the importance of those prior relationships. We celebrate the past. On the other hand, when we get something that's new, we are prone to kick the old to the curb and hope someone else will take it away from us, yeah? And I think that complicated relationship we have with things that are old can impact how we think about the first 3/4 of our Bible, the Old Testament. What do we do with the old because we have a new? Well, Marcion had an answer. If you don't know him, I'm not surprised. He lived within 100 years of Jesus' resurrection. And he has his idea about what to do with the Old Testament was simple. Get rid of it. It's old. Kick it to the curb. Let somebody else carry it away. Now, the early church rejected that idea. But I've often wondered whether or not, in the end, Marcion got his way. Even though the Old Testament comprises 3/4 of our Bible, I think it gets a whole lot less of our Bible study and Bible reading attention than that number might suggest. And so the question is, what do we do with the Old Testament? Well, how about asking Jesus what to do? And how about asking him on Easter Sunday? Luke 24 is where we're going to be. If you have a Bible with you and would like to follow along, we're not going to be treating these two stories in detail, but I'm particularly interested in where the Old Testament appears in the story of Jesus that first Easter Sunday, walking with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then the story that follows immediately on the heels of that, these two disciples on the road to Emmaus who are going to be in the upper room with the other disciples. And what we find when we ask Jesus the question, what do you think about the Old Testament on that first Easter Sunday? He likes it. In fact, I'm going to characterize it in this way. He's going to say it is the good Old Testament. And there are 3 things he wants us to know about it. It still belongs. It all belongs, and it makes a difference. Let's have a look. It still belongs. Now, the story that we're talking about, the first part of this story, begins as these two disciples leave Jerusalem and head home towards Emmaus. It is Easter Sunday, and they are involved in a conversation. Jesus asks, so what is it that you guys were talking about? And I don't know that you get a better summary of what Easter Holy Week is about. Well, we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, powerful in word and before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Easter Sunday, Holy Week. I mean, it's all there, isn't it? And it's the perfect setup. When Jesus steps onto the scene, all he has to do is say, I'm he. Right? It was all there. But he cloaked his identity from them and instead of using his presence, the living, breathing evidence that the Father had accepted the sacrifice for sin. Instead of doing that, he goes all Old Testament on them. And I think we'll miss it if we don't tune our ears to the way in which Judaism of the first century labeled our Old Testament. Look, I've underlined some of the language that we see in these two story sets. Jesus said to them, "You're slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken." And then Jesus, beginning with Moses, first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the prophets, went into depth into all the scriptures, capital S, scriptures label. And then when we're in the upper, we move move a little bit later in the walk, Jesus talks about opening all the scriptures to them. And then shift the story scene from the road to the upper room and more Old Testament, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. We'll talk about those labels in a little bit further. And the scriptures, again, were you counting? Were you counting 6 times in 21 verses? On Easter Sunday, Jesus is digging in to the Old Testament. Folks, if the Old Testament still belongs on that first Easter Sunday, can we come to any other conclusion that Jesus is saying to us? It still belongs. But how much of it? How much of it? Let's take a look at what Jesus does here in Luke's reporting of it, and I think we're going to come to the conclusion it all belongs. And to do that, we need to do a little bit of geography and calculation and all of that sort of stuff. I want to look at where they were going, how much distance, how much time, because that gives us a sense of how much available and characterizes the space that this conversation. We'll look at some of the language. And finally, 10 minutes in, wow, it took me 10 minutes. 10 minutes to get to a map, but here's a map. And what I want you to help, I want to work with you on is figuring out, well, where did this story occur? It starts in Jerusalem over here, and then ends at Emmaus and then goes back to Jerusalem. But the question is, where is Emmaus? And there are 3 of them on the screen: Emmaus Colonia, Emmaus Castellum, and way up in the left corner, Emmaus Nicopolis. Nicopolis is about 19 miles away, if you're trying to scale that up a bit. And there's a debate about which of these 3 places might, in fact, be the Emmaus towards which Jesus and the 2 disciples on the road were heading. As a Bible geographer, this is the sort of evidence that I would use to weigh those options. Is Emmaus mentioned in some other piece of early literature that might help me identify which of these was the most likely player? Is that place supported by archaeological remains from the first century, which would suggest people were living in that space at that time? It needs to be close enough to Jerusalem to allow an out and back in the same day, because this story that evolves out to Emmaus and then back to Jerusalem to the upper room occurs in actually about half a day. So we need to have distances that work with there. And Luke gives us a metric. He says that Emmaus is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And so we need something that has a defensible relationship to that. Well, when we look at the 3 options, I'm really struggling with Emmaus Nicopolis way out there on the coast. That's 19 miles away. It misses on a lot of points, and maybe the biggest one is that's way too far out from Jerusalem to get there and back in half a day. I think the best evidence, I won't go through it all, but the best evidence for me is here, although I'm not closing the door on Emmaus Castellum either. Emmaus Colonia, there we go, that's the word I'm looking at. Emmaus Colonia is about 3.5-4 miles west of Jerusalem. So let's put that against a timeline. So we have a distance about we're traveling. Now let's put it against a timeline. We know the Easter Sunday morning story starts early in the morning at sunrise, and I'm suggesting that maybe by 8 o'clock these guys knew what was they'd heard about the empty tomb. And I'm thinking at the latest they're leaving for Emmaus about 11 in the morning because they're planning to be home for lunch. It's about an hour and a half walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus Colonia for lunch. But look at this. This is the timeline against which that story evolves. they spend all afternoon walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, have dinner, and then race back to Jerusalem, I'm thinking, by about 8 o'clock or so in the evening. If you look at the amount of time the Emmaus disciples spent with Jesus, we're looking at a factor of about 5 times longer than it would take to simply walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus, right? We're looking at at least 7, maybe 8 elapsed hours and only going about 3.5 miles. And that means although the painting of the walk looks like this, it probably was a walk and a stop and visit for a while, a walk and maybe sitting down and visiting for a while, and then walking more. I think we can easily lose track of the time. We're talking about a very long teaching window, and that allows for an awful lot of Old Testament to be discussed. Now, if we look at the language Luke uses beyond that, we're going to see that it is supportive of a very comprehensive look at the Old Testament. Here it is again from Luke's recording. Jesus said, "You're slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken." And beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them what was said to them in all the scriptures. And then in the upper room, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. That trilogy is one that's worth learning just a bit more about. Although we divide our Old Testament up somewhat differently, in the Jewish tradition, it divides like this: the Torah, the law, you see the first of the 3 elements, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, the writings, and look which is the first of the Ketuvim, the Psalms. So when Jesus talks about the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, again, it's a very comprehensive look. Now, folks, I don't think Jesus read every verse in the Old Testament with these guys, but we're left with the impression that there is nothing in that Old Testament that didn't somehow involve the story of Easter and the forgiveness of sins accomplished through it. I don't know what other conclusion we can come to that not only does it belong, but it really all belongs. It all belongs, and it makes a difference. It makes a really big difference. And our English translations sometimes make it a little harder to see. Maybe as hard to see as this painting by Fritz von Ude from the 19th century. You know the subject matter, but you might be adjusting your glasses or wondering why I would put a picture up that's out of focus. Well, Fritz von Ude painted a portrait of this scene, but was intentionally sort of out of focus to give us a sense of how difficult that day was for those 2 disciples. And Luke gives us a bit of a before and after picture. This is the before picture, and here's the language that he uses to describe it. He spends some time, first notice, giving us the before picture, before Jesus lays the Old Testament and his resurrection on them. And I think here our English translations, at least my NIV translation, does us a little bit of a disservice. It says that the disciples were talking about and discussing with one another the events of the day. Talking about and discussing with one another. I pulled the Greek out, not because that might be of interest to you, but look at the language that's behind that Greek. I think the English of the NIV underplays it a bit. This was not a polite exchange. This was a highly animated, very emotionally intense exchange that these guys were having before Jesus showed up. I imagine, given what I know of the ancient Near East, that their arms were flying because you can't speak well unless you make these sorts of big movements in the world. But look at the language. They engaged in lively exchange. They were arguing for a perspective, for a point of view. They were emotionally exchanging opinions. There's grief. There's distress. They did not expect Jesus to die, and once he was dead, they did not expect to see him again. And that would make for one amazing conversation, right, that's going on like this. This is where they were before Jesus came up and started talking to them about the Old Testament. But when Jesus puts the lens of Easter on the Old Testament, we see changes occurring. And look at the after picture. their eyes were opened. They saw things fall into place that they didn't see their heart. Were not our hearts burning within us as he walked with us along the way and opened the scriptures to us? And they ran back to Jerusalem. They didn't wait till the next morning. They had just come from Jerusalem. It's unthinkable that you would go reverse that unless you had good reason. They ran back to Jerusalem, and there in the upper room, Jesus opened minds so that they could understand. You see the big difference, the before and after picture? The Old Testament laid onto the Easter story made a difference. So what does Jesus think about the Old Testament? Well, it's the good Old Testament. It hasn't stopped being that. It still belongs. It all belongs, and man, does it make a difference. I wonder if our Bible reading and Bible study reflect that. Isn't that a bit of a challenging thought? Does our time in the Old Testament really reflect what Jesus thinks about the Old Testament? And I know you might be thinking to yourself, well, of course, you have a PhD in Hebrew and Old Testament. Someone like you has to talk like this. It's easy for you to dig into the Old Testament. But folks, let me tell you, long before I went to graduate school, I was a Bible reader. And even now, on the other side of that academic preparation, I still struggle at times with the Old Testament. So let's just be honest with each other and say, this is tough stuff for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's got way more pages, right? Isn't this true? It's got like 2.5 times the page count of the New Testament. And if page count is intimidating for you as a reader, that's an intimidating notion of taking on that. Because it has so many pages, it takes way longer to read. If you were to read through the whole New Testament, it would take you about, 18 hours and 20 minutes? You ready for the Old Testament? 52 hours and 20 minutes. That's an intimidating amount of time to add, right? It takes way longer to read. It evolves over way more time. Right? I think stories that evolve over longer time are harder stories to keep together. In the New Testament, if we kind of exclude the prophecy parts that reach beyond the horizon of the New Testament era, it runs about 100 years. Now that's a while, right? But it's just a little bit more than a lifetime, and I can wrap my mind to a story arc that looks like that. The Old Testament is 15 times longer. Right? And that's conservatively speaking, that runs only from about the time of Moses. So, you're going back even farther in that story arc, more than 2,000 years earlier. It's way longer. It introduces way more people. Right? Have you had that experience? Reading the New Testament versus reading the Old? The New Testament introduces us to about 250 people. Look at that Old Testament number. Over 3,000, approaches 3,000 names. I've got a chance at 250, 3,000. It's like I throw my arms up. It travels through less familiar spaces, the Old Testament does. Now, for sure, both the Old and New Testament both have a home in this space, right? In the Promised Land, the land of Israel. But in the New Testament era, we tend to go north and then west. And that's Indo-European country. That's country whose stories we know a little bit better. The Old Testament goes south and then east into spaces that we're less familiar with today. And it frames against a much more remote cultural context. When we're reading the New Testament, there are some things that sound strange and unusual to us, but we've got a chance in a Greco-Roman world that has a European flavor to it. It sounds a little bit more like us. Man, you get into the Old Testament and the culture looks really remote and really different and puzzling to us. I'm starting to get discouraged myself looking at this, right? You're looking at a set of books, a library of books that takes It takes way longer to read because it has way, way more pages. It evolves over lots more time, introduces us to many more people, travels through less familiar places, and frames against a most remote culture. Is it any surprise that many of us have said, okay, I'm gonna do it. This year I'm gonna read my way through the whole Old Testament, and we get in a ways and all of a sudden go, I think I'm gonna go back to the New Testament, right? It's more challenging to do. So what do you do when you get frustrated with that Old Testament? Just go for a walk, right? Where's he going with this? Well, I want to use an outdoor metaphor because I want to give you some help in reading the Old Testament. I want to give you some suggestions on how you might start reading the Old Testament afresh and find some things in it that you hadn't seen before. And I want to use an outdoor metaphor. Many of you know that Marmee and I absolutely love the natural world and outdoors and hiking, and we do a lot off trail. And that means that there are times when we become temporarily uncertain about where we are. You might call it lost. I'm just temporarily uncertain about where we are. And if the GPS signal isn't what it should be, we need to go old school, which is take some bearings and use a topo map. And if that's a new concept for you, just a quick thought, it's simply taking your top of the compass and pointing it at a prominent feature and reading the value, the magnetic heading towards that. That isn't particularly helpful, but if you can do that through 3 locations, you end up with those lines crossing on a topo map and you have a sense of where you are. And that's what I like to do as an Old Testament reader. I like to take 3 bearings. And I think if you're struggling to get into the Old Testament and you would say, is there something you can do to help me? This is your moment. I'm going to help you take 3 bearings that will help you do any story, any psalm, any piece of prophecy. You will get more out of it if you take these 3 bearings. What time is it? Where am I? And what's the point? Let's start with time. First of all, there is a simple reality that the Old Testament evolves over this longer arc. And as we look at that longer arc, we are dealing with thousands of years of changing culture and space. And so it means that the story of Abraham and Sarah in their era or time, and the story of Deborah in her time, and the story of King David in his time, they're all going to be different stories because they occur at different points on the timeline. And so I would encourage you to have a general sense of the large arc of the story of the Old Testament, and then fill in some details as you go. But let's start with the simplest, broadest arc. We start with the creation of the world, the post-fall issues that come beyond that. Then we move into the story of Abraham and his families. That's another discrete epoch in the story of the Old Testament. We have an Egyptian extension of the story that culminates in the Exodus or departure from Egypt and time in wilderness. Then we have the story of Joshua and Judges, the conquest and settlement and struggle story with the politics, right? That's that era of the conquest and the era of the Judges. Then we have a political change. We have kings that are going to rule ancient Israel. That doesn't keep God's people from leading the lifestyle that he asked of them, and so we end up with a period of exile and a period of return. If you can just keep that big arc in mind, you'll be able to take a psalm or a story and put it into that picture, and that will be a very helpful starting point. The first bearing, what time is it? Yeah. Second bearing, where are we? What's the place? What's the space that I'm in? If there's one thing that I've learned as a Bible geographer, it is that stories belong in places. And that you can't take a story or a psalm or a piece of prophecy and move it from here over to here without changing the essence of what that piece of poetry or what that story is about. Now, geography is a very complex enterprise, and as a Bible geographer, that's the sort of enterprise that I'm involved in. But remember, we're getting you started, so let's start simple. The Old Testament evolves against 8 locations, generally speaking. We're in the Garden of Eden. That's location 1. We then move outside of the Garden of Eden, but we haven't quite gotten to Canaan. That'll be the 3rd, Canaan. Then we're going to leave Canaan and spend some time in Egypt, time in the wilderness, time back in Israel. This is Joshua Judges, re-entry of the land. Then we have exiles, particularly outside the land, Babylon and Persia. Again, if you're taking a bearing and you're looking at that piece of poetry, looking at that story, take that bearing and say, where is the story evolving? Because all of these places are different, right? We tend to look at labels and maybe homogenize them, and if we haven't been to Israel, the ancient Near East sort of all looks the same in our mind. Let me disabuse you of that notion. This is the wilderness. This is the central mountain country of Israel. Places that are very different from one another, and they carry very different human experiences and stories. Even within Israel itself, from south to north, you have these dramatic changes in the space. This is the southern Negev. This is the Shephelah, the foothills of the central mountains. And here's the area of Mount Hermon. Yeah? You can see every one of those is different. And again, my point, every time you put a story in a new space, it becomes something different than it was before. So the second bearing I want to take as an Old Testament reader when I'm feeling a little stuck is where in this matrix I'm running. So far, so good. 2 bearings. What time is it? Where am I? Is the second. And now what's the point? What's the point? Well, there's lots of points. But again, we're trying to keep this simple. So let's do our best to zero in on just 3 main points. Before I get to them, let me make sure that you understand this. As the Old Testament speaks, it's not like a staircase we have at home maybe that just goes straight down one direction. The Old Testament idea pool runs like this in a spiral. And so we start with an idea as we move down the staircase. We leave it behind, and sure enough, we don't make much more progress, maybe a turn or 2 down the spiral staircase, and we're back to that idea again. So don't expect the Old Testament to introduce an element, an idea, and then discuss it completely. It will introduce it, leave it, and come back to it, often in a different time and place, because that will change, right? The way that idea looks. So what are the 3 big ideas that I look for as a Bible reader? What's the point? That's the bearing I'm taking. Is it saying something about the identity of God? Is the psalm, is the story saying something about frustrations and failures of the human experience? Or is it offering an insight into God's passion to rescue frustrated and failing people? Just a little bit of a look at each of these. The Old Testament grew up in a world that was horribly confused about who God was. Most ancient peoples looked at nature, for which they had no scientific explanation, and assigned deities to natural forces. Rain, thunder, death, all of these things become deities in the ancient Near Eastern world. And that means you have lots of them because there's lots of unexplained natural phenomena. So what does the Bible do right out of the gate? It separates God and nature. While the pagan world put them together, we find the Old Testament saying God is something different than nature, like this. God is the creator of all things. That's strategic and intentional in the minds to fix a problem in the ancient worldview. And he goes on to say, none of those other deities is authentic. They are not authentic deities. You shall have no other gods before me is a fundamental credo, the first commandment, because it is God fixing mistaken notions about who he is. And let me take on here one of the things that I hear occasionally and maybe is in the room. So I want to take it on. And that is the notion that the God of the Old Testament is incompatible with the God of the New. That the God of the Old Testament is a judgmental, angry God, and the God of the New Testament is a loving, kind, and friendly face. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And I take you to this passage in Exodus to prove the point. Within Judaism, you have these words being the foundation piece for understanding the identity of God. And if you look at the language, it will be helpful for you to hear that this is language that Moses uses to describe the Lord immediately after one of the great post-Exodus sins, when God's people of the past, as Moses was up on Mount Sinai getting the commandments, was building an idol and worshiping an idol at the base of the mountain. And if there's a moment for the divine thunder to fly, this is it. But look at what we find. In the face of sin, the Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sins. God of the Old Testament is a God of love and compassion and forgiveness. Third bearing, right? I'm looking for the big idea. One of the big ideas I'm looking for, the identity of God. What does it say about him? Second thing that I'm looking for, a big idea that gets communicated often, Psalms, prophets, stories, frustration and failures in the human experience. Once we walk out of the Edenic, perfect place, the Garden of Eden, we are walking into a world of frustration and failure. And the first efforts to go back, to rewind things and get back to that perfect place fail because they simply didn't work. We read about a natural disaster. Would a natural disaster clean up the problems of the world by destroying what was underneath it in the flood? No. Would human ingenuity, the building of the Tower of Babel, would human ingenuity be able to restore life to what it was? Well, that didn't work either. And so, again and again, from page to page, from psalm to story, we read about the frustrations and failures of the human experience. I would look for it because it makes you feel connected to those stories and psalms. You feel the family dysfunction. You feel the guilt that people feel over their sin when you read those stories looking and psalms reading for the frustration and failures that are inherent in the human experience. And then the third thing that I would look for, the third big idea towards which we spiral again and again, is God's passion to rescue. Again, let me fix a misconception that has been around and maybe in the room. And that is, there's a different path to salvation in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, right? That is not the case. You are saved in the Old Testament just as you are saved in the New Testament. It is faith in the words and promises of God that saves. Look at the juxtapositioning. In the Old Testament, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. Ephesians 2, for it is by grace you've been saved through faith. The pathway is the same. The difference is the way in which the promises of God are communicated, right? Look at what the Apostle Paul does in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the gospel, the good news in connection with Christ died, was buried, and raised. That's the trilogy in the New Testament that encapsulates the promises of God. Faith in those promises results in forgiveness. And so we see it, but in the Old Testament, we have the Lord using different symbols. And so as an Old Testament reader, our trigger to saying, oh, I see something gospel-like there, is going to be discussions about land, about family that becomes a nation, and about blessing being put back on the earth. Again, as readers of these two testaments, it is faith in the words and promises of God that redeems, that saves. It's simply the fact that the gospel looks a little different symbolically in the Old and New Testament. In the New Testament, it's the cross, the tomb, and Jesus the Messiah. In the Old Testament, it is the family turned nation. It is mention of land, and it is the mention of the blessing restored through Messiah. God's passion to rescue is another of the three big ideas. So, in our third bearing, we've got time, we've got place. I want to orient myself to the point, the big idea, reminding myself that these big ideas evolve and we circle back to them. These are the big ideas that I would look for. And some of you may say, well, there's more to it than that. Yes, of course, there's more to it than that. But we're talking about how can I get started reading the Old Testament? Look for what that passage says about who God is. Look for what it says about the challenges of the human experiences, the failures, the frustrations. Look for God's passion to rescue people who are caught up in those frustrations and failures of the human experience. Whether you're hiking and feeling a little displaced, disoriented, lost, or whether you're reading your Old Testament and feeling a little lost or disoriented, I think the solution can be the same. Take the bearing. Take the bearing, starting with what time is it, where is it, where am I, and thirdly, what's the point? Well, today I purposely set out to challenge you. Have you felt some challenge? I purposely set out to challenge you because I'd like you to think about your use of the Old Testament in the context of Jesus' perspective on the Old Testament that first Easter. When we get something new, we're tempted to take the old and put it out on the curb and hope something will take it away. Can I legitimately do that with the Old Testament? Not if we're following the Easter Sunday story of Jesus. And if you think about this, if the Old Testament belongs, if it all belongs, if it can make a difference on Easter Sunday of all times, is it not still something that is a good Old Testament for us? And folks, I pray that God may bless you to live out this incredible Easter legacy we have. And that is seeing that the First Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's really the good Old Testament.
Yes, amen. Jack, I really appreciated that you said, I meant to challenge you today. I felt that challenge in a good way because the story of Scripture, God is so intentional and we're invited into it. And I appreciated that you said, I have these PhDs, I've studied the language, and yet there's still so much I'm learning every day. And we're invited into that, to learn every day, to not feel like we have to have it all figured out when we come to Scripture, but we just get to come to Scripture and learn and read a passage and feel confused about it and then study and learn more and ask good questions. And we're invited into the journey through looking at how Jesus viewed the Old Testament, that it's a story, an incredible story. It is the story. And we get to spend our entire lives learning about it. And it's fun. And guess what? We get to do it together. So thank you so much for being here with us. I'm so thankful that you were able to be here to share that with us. And I'm going to close us in prayer. Jack will be up here if you want to chat with him, and we'll dismiss from there. But Heavenly Father, I'm just thankful. I'm thankful today for your intentionality, the intentionality of your word. I'm thankful for the beauty of your word. I'm thankful that we can step back and see the big themes that all point to you. That what you did to step into our failures and our weaknesses, that you are compassionate and good and faithful. That we are part of a story, Lord, that we're not just here randomly, but you have a purpose for our lives, that you desire a relationship and connection with us, and we get to, together as God's people, lean into that and to have grace with one another and to grow and to learn and to do it all with a heart of gratitude, that you are ever present with your people. God, we love you. We thank you for today. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And as we scatter out into the week until we gather again, may he turn his face towards you and give you his peace. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If we have not had a chance to meet you, we really would love to connect. I will be back at that table. Please come say hi, grab a gift. If you want to order a sweatshirt, you can do that back there as well. Feel free to talk to Jack. And God bless you. We will see you next week.